Imagine waking up one morning to headlines announcing that Apple has officially released its own Linux distribution. Not a skin, not a compatibility layer, not a developer experiment, but a full-fledged, consumer-ready operating system built on the Linux kernel and shaped by Apple's design philosophy. At first, it sounds almost impossible. Apple, the company famous for its tightly controlled ecosystem, polished proprietary software, and carefully guarded hardware-software integration, joining forces with the world of open source in a way it never has before. Yet, when you look deeper into Apple's history, its current trajectory, and the evolution of Linux itself, the idea becomes strangely fascinating and not entirely unrealistic. This hypothetical future raises profound questions about technology, power, creativity, freedom, and the very meaning of open source in a world dominated by trillion-dollar companies. To understand what it would mean if Apple made its own Linux distro, we first need to understand Apple's complicated relationship with open source. Despite its reputation for closed systems, Apple is not a stranger to open-source software. macOS itself is built on Darwin, which includes a Unix-based kernel called XNU, and many open-source components like BSD utilities, LLVM, WebKit, and more. Apple actively contributes to certain open-source projects, but it always does so on its own terms. The company embraces open source when it aligns with its goals and locks things down when it believes user experience, security, or business interests demand it. Linux, however, is different. Linux is not just another open source component. It is a symbol of decentralization, community-driven development, and freedom from corporate control. That symbolic weight alone makes the idea of an Apple Linux distro deeply disruptive. Now imagine Apple announcing a new operating system, perhaps not replacing macOS outright, but existing alongside it. This OS would be built on the Linux kernel, fully compliant with open-source licensing, but wrapped in Apple's unmistakable design language. The interface would be clean, fluid, minimal, and deeply integrated with Apple services. Animations would be smooth, fonts would be perfectly tuned, and every interaction would feel intentional. Unlike most Linux distros that emphasize flexibility and user choice, Apple's Linux would emphasize coherence, simplicity, and a carefully curated experience. It would feel less like traditional Linux and more like macOS's philosophical cousin, except with a radically different foundation underneath. One of the most immediate impacts would be on perception. For decades, Linux on the desktop has struggled with public image. Among developers and power users, it's respected and even loved. Among mainstream users, it's often seen as complex, unfinished, or intimidating. If Apple were to release a Linux distro, that perception could change overnight. Suddenly, Linux wouldn't just be the operating system of servers, hackers, and enthusiasts. It would be the foundation of a premium, consumer-friendly product backed by one of the most influential tech companies in the world. This alone could legitimize Linux on the desktop in ways no community-driven effort ever could. But Apple wouldn't simply take an existing Linux distro and rebrand it. It would almost certainly create its own distribution from the ground up, carefully selecting components, modifying the kernel, and building custom frameworks on top. Performance would be a major focus. Apple is obsessed with efficiency, and its work on Apple Silicon shows how far it's willing to go to optimize software for hardware. In an Apple Linux world, the kernel would be tuned specifically for Apple-designed chips, resulting in incredible battery life, fast boot times, and smooth multitasking. The Linux kernel is already highly adaptable, and Apple's engineering resources could push it into new territory, especially on ARM-based systems. Security would be another cornerstone. Apple markets itself as a privacy-first company, and any Linux distro it created would reflect that. Secure boot, hardware-backed encryption, sandboxed applications, and strict permission systems would be standard. Apple might introduce its own security frameworks on top of Linux, similar to how it uses system integrity protection and gatekeeper on macOS. This could create tension with the traditional Linux philosophy, which values user control and transparency. The question would be whether Apple's Linux remains truly open in practice, or whether it becomes open in name only, with critical components locked behind proprietary layers. The app ecosystem would be one of the most fascinating aspects of this scenario. Linux has always struggled with application fragmentation. Different package managers, libraries, and desktop environments make it difficult for developers to target Linux as a unified platform. Apple hates fragmentation. If it made a Linux distro, it would almost certainly introduce a single, official app distribution system, possibly inspired by the App Store. Developers would submit applications packaged in a standardized format, reviewed by Apple, and distributed through a central store. From a usability standpoint, this would be a huge win. From an open-source purist's perspective, it could feel like a betrayal of Linux's decentralized nature. At the same time, Apple could bridge the gap between open-source software and commercial development. Imagine a Linux distro where open-source applications coexist seamlessly with high-quality commercial apps from major developers like Adobe, Microsoft, and others. One of Linux's biggest weaknesses on the desktop has been the lack of industry-standard creative and productivity software. Apple's influence could change that. If Apple committed to Linux as a platform, other companies might follow, seeing it as a stable, profitable ecosystem rather than a niche market. Then there's the developer experience. Apple already has a massive developer community built around Xcode, Swift, and its various platforms. An Apple Linux distro could extend this ecosystem in powerful ways. Developers could write applications using familiar Apple tools and frameworks while targeting a Linux-based system. This could blur the lines between macOS, iOS, and Linux development, creating a more unified software landscape. Swift, which is already open source and supported on Linux, could become the primary language for native applications on Apple's Linux distro. This would strengthen Swift's position as a serious alternative to languages like C++, Rust, and Python in the Linux world. The open source community's reaction would be complex and divided. On one hand, Apple's involvement could bring massive resources, visibility, and legitimacy to Linux. Kernel development could benefit from Apple's contributions, especially in areas like power management, graphics, and ARM optimization. On the other hand, many in the community would be wary of Apple's influence. There would be concerns about Apple steering Linux development in directions that benefit its own products rather than the broader ecosystem. Trust would be a major issue. Linux thrives on collaboration and transparency, while Apple thrives on secrecy and control. Reconciling these cultures would be incredibly difficult. Hardware support would be another critical factor. Apple's Linux distro would almost certainly be designed primarily for Apple hardware. MacBooks, Mac Minis, and perhaps even iPads could run this new OS. Drivers would be optimized, performance would be excellent, and everything would just work. This could create a stark contrast with traditional Linux where hardware compatibility can be hit or miss. At the same time, Apple might restrict the OS to its own devices, or at least strongly discourage installation on third-party hardware. This would clash with Linux's traditional openness, where users expect to install the OS on whatever hardware they choose. Now imagine Apple taking this even further and positioning its Linux distro as the future of computing beyond macOS. macOS, while powerful, is still tied to legacy decisions and proprietary constraints. A Linux-based system could give Apple more flexibility in the long run. It could unify its platforms more deeply, sharing a common kernel architecture across desktops, laptops, servers, and embedded devices. Apple already uses different kernels for different platforms. Moving closer to Linux could simplify its internal development while aligning it with industry standards. The implications for enterprise and education would be enormous. Linux already dominates servers and cloud infrastructure. If Apple introduced a polished, secure Linux distro, it could appeal to businesses that want the stability of Linux combined with Apple's usability and support. Schools and universities might adopt it as a teaching platform, exposing students to open-source software in a user-friendly environment. This could create a new generation of users who are comfortable with Linux from an early age, reshaping the future of computing literacy. There's also a philosophical question at the heart of this idea. What does open source mean when a company like Apple gets involved at this level? Open source has always been about freedom, collaboration, and community. Apple's brand is built on control, curation, and premium experiences. If Apple made its own Linux distro, it would challenge the open source world to redefine itself. Is open source still open if the most popular implementation is controlled by a single company? Or does Apple's involvement simply represent the next evolution of open source in a world where corporate and community interests are increasingly intertwined? From a competitive standpoint, the ripple effects would be massive. Microsoft, which has already embraced Linux in many ways through Azure and the Windows subsystem for Linux, would be forced to rethink its desktop strategy. Google, with ChromeOS already based on Linux, might see Apple's move as direct competition. Traditional Linux distributions would have to adapt, finding new ways to differentiate themselves in a world where Linux suddenly has a mainstream polished face. Some distros might benefit from increased interest in Linux overall, while others might struggle to compete with Apple's resources and marketing power. User choice would also evolve in interesting ways. Many people who love Linux appreciate the freedom to customize everything, to choose their desktop environment, window manager, and workflow. Apple's Linux would likely limit this freedom in favor of consistency. Users would have to decide what they value more, absolute control or a refined, cohesive experience. This tension already exists within the Linux world, but Apple's entry would amplify it dramatically. In this hypothetical future, debates would rage across forums, social media, and conferences. Some would argue that Apple's Linux is not real Linux, that it betrays the spirit of open source. Others would argue that it brings Linux to millions of people who would otherwise never touch it. Both sides would be right in their own way. Technology is never just about code. It's about people, values, and power. Over time, Apple's Linux distro could evolve in unexpected ways. It might start as a niche product for developers or power users, then gradually expand into the mainstream. Or it might remain a specialized platform, influencing the broader Linux ecosystem without ever replacing traditional distros. Apple might even open source more of its own technologies as a result, contributing back in ways that reshape the industry. Or it might tightly control the most important layers, maintaining its competitive edge while benefiting from Linux's flexibility. Ultimately, the idea of Apple making its own Linux distro is less about whether it will actually happen and more about what it reveals about the future of computing. The lines between open and closed, free and proprietary, community and corporation are becoming increasingly blurred. Linux is no longer just a hobbyist's OS. It's the backbone of the modern digital world. Apple is no longer just a hardware company. It's a platform, a services provider, and a cultural force. If these two worlds were to truly collide, the result would be something entirely new, challenging our assumptions about control, creativity, and collaboration. In that future, users might not even think about kernels, licenses, or philosophies. They would simply use a computer that feels fast, secure, and beautiful. Behind the scenes, though, a quiet revolution would be unfolding. Open source would be sitting at the heart of one of the most influential ecosystems on the planet. And the question would no longer be whether Linux is ready for the mainstream, but whether the mainstream is ready to accept what Linux has always stood for, even when it comes wrapped in aluminum, glass, and a glowing Apple logo.